G'day guys, Steve with Broken Sprocket. In this video, I'm going to do a comparison of Suzuki's DRZ400E versus the mighty RMX450Z. Now you might think that this is a little bit of an unfair comparison video, being as though the DRZ is a carburetted bike produced back in the year 2000 and is still currently available against the fire-breathing 450 power of the RMX450Z, which was a fuel-injected, much more modern motorbike. But I'm going to do things in category by category, all sorts of different stuff, including the value for money, the purchase prices, the aftermarket accessories, and also the rideability of both bikes. So I've got myself a pretty good list here of different things to compare each bike to, and we'll see which one comes out on top, with each category getting 1 point. So let's get started. Firstly, I owned the RMX450Z and I purchased it brand new, and I owned that bike for 3.5 years. My brother Dean had the identical same bike and he owned his one for 5 years. So I'm pretty sure I know quite a bit about the RMX450Z and how it works and what it's like. I've owned a DRZ for 6 months, but I've been on many rides where many of my friends have had DRZ, so I'm quite familiar with the DRZ400 also. Okay, I was going to start with the purchase price of the bikes, but to get them both to the same specs, there's a couple of things you have to buy for the RMX to get it to the point where I could have got this bike straight off the showroom floor with the same accessories. Back in 2016, I purchased my RMX brand new. And there was a brand new DRZ400 also at the dealership parked right next to it, and the dealer tried to convince me to buy the DRZ, but I was convinced the 450 was the way to go, as it looked far better than the DRZ, and it was all modern and all new and all shiny, and everything looked fantastic. Now he offered me the RMX for $11,200. That's how much I paid to get that bike out the showroom. And he also offered me in 2016 the DRZ for $8,500. So it was quite more expensive to purchase the RMX, but I had to have it. Now the DRZ at the time came with the hand guards, it came with a bash plate, it also came with good Suzuki radiator protection, and the dealer told me at the time that this was $700 worth of extra value for no extra cost. So I had to purchase all of those components for the RMX because it didn't come with any of that stuff, so I had to buy radiator guards, an aluminium bash plate and hand guards. So we can just say now that the RMX owes me another $700 to be at the same level that the DRZ would have come out the showroom floor. So now we're looking at a price of around $11,800. Well, actually it's $11,900. So now we're looking at a bike that's $3,400 more expensive to take out of the showroom floor at the same setup as the DRZ was. So for value for money, the DRZ is way better. In fact, $3,400 can buy an awful lot of accessories and a lot of fuel and a lot of registrations for the same price of the RMX400. So we'll give the value for money to the DRZ400. So after riding the RMX for a short period of time, I realised that the 6-litre fuel tank that it came with was quite pathetic, and I was only getting around 60 kilometres to each ride before I had to refuel that bike. So it wasn't a very good bike to ride because I couldn't go on very far adventures or even a decent ride. It was quite useless. Whereas the DRZ comes with a 10-litre fuel tank, so I can get around 160 kilometres for the same ride on the DRZ. So as far as off the shelf, the fuel for the DRZ is far better, so that's another point for the DRZ in fuel economy. So I eventually replaced the fuel tank on the DRZ with an IMS fuel tank, which got me a 9-litre fuel tank. Now I could go for a decent day's ride, something similar to what this bike would get from standard, but that was at a cost of $500. So there's another $500 to add to the price of the RMX450Z. And with that added to the price, the RMX450Z is now a $12,400 bike compared to the $8,500 that I could have bought the DRZ for. So with that said, just getting the RMX to the level of the DRZ you're looking at another $3,900 on top. Okay, let's go straight to the power of both bikes. Now the RMX is obviously a 450 and mine had a cherry bomb in it which made it really go like a real 450. It really cracked. Fuel injected, it had power to burn. For aggressive, fast, instant power, the RMX would easily smash the DRZ. But in overall top speed of the bikes with standard gearing, they would both be around the same speed level, around that 130 kilometers an hour, and you're probably pushing your limits on both bikes. But for that aggressive power, the RMX wins that one quite easily. So that will bring us now to the reliability of both bikes. Now the DRZ has been around since the year 2000 in Australia, and it has a reputation for reliability that's probably unbeaten in the dirt bike motorcycle world. These things, I've seen videos of people having 70 to 80,000 kilometers and not touch the engine. Obviously the RMX has a much shorter lifespan as it's pretty much a motocross bike. It's based off the 2011, I think, championship winning RMZ450, so its reliability is diminished because of all that power, and it's just not a long lasting motor, so easily the DRZ will win in the reliability stakes. The RMX is probably more like the service intervals of what a motocross bike is. Very short service intervals, oil change needs to be done quite regularly. And with the DRZ, it has a much longer service intervals. So the DRZ would easily, as far as serviceability and service intervals goes, wins in that challenge. So another point to the DRZ on service intervals. One thing I like about the DRZ is that the swing arm and all of the linkages and all that have grease nipples in it, so it's just a simple hit as you're servicing your bike with the grease gun, and your swing arm and bearings and all that are all serviced. Where with the RMX you have to pull the whole thing apart, service the bearings individually and push it in, and then put the whole bike back together again, which is a real pain in the butt. And let's get realistic, who's going to pull their bike apart as regularly as you would just shoving a grease gun on and pumping the thing full of grease? Let's address the looks of the bikes. Now the RMX is a far more modern looking bike and it looked absolutely fantastic, there's no denying it. The RMX looks really nice, whereas the DRZ is quite outdated and it still looks like, you know, the year 2000, whereas the RMX was very modern and nice looking. So the RMX easily is a far nicer looking bike than the DRZ. Let's talk suspension. Now the DRZ has old traditional type forks, whereas the RMX has the USD forks and it's far more modern suspension. So you would think the RMX would have great suspension. Well, no, the RMX doesn't have great suspension. It has 47mm Showa USD forks, and those forks were terrible for that bike. Often you would do big jumps, you would expect it to be able to do this as it was based off a motocross bike, but those forks would go metal to metal, they would bottom out every single time. So the RMX had 47mm shocks, whereas this exact same year model 250 RMZ450 has 48mm. So the RMX had smaller shock absorbers than a 250 has, which just doesn't make sense. In fact, it had the exact same shock absorbers, that my RM125 that I built had, which was a 2002. So those shocks were definitely not suited for the RMX450Z. They weren't very good at all. Now the DRZ has old type suspension, but at least these are 49mm shocks, and I'm not expecting the DRZ to do motocross style jumps as it's not a motocross bike, whereas the RMX basically is a motocross bike with a headlight put on the front of it. So the RMX suspension wasn't that great. And as far as going up rocky hills and deflecting off different things, the back end of the RMX would skip from side to side to side and almost be uncontrollable to ride. Whereas the DRZ, it seems to absorb the obstacles and just keeps going forward. People call this the tractor of the DRZ, and it really is. It will just keep on ploughing forward. So although the RMX looks as though it has better suspension, it really wasn't that good for what you expected, whereas you don't expect much of the suspension on the DRZ, and it gives you more than you expect. So I don't know. I wouldn't say the RMX has great suspension, and you're not expecting much from the DRZ. So I'm just going to leave it there, and you can decide which suspension would suit you more. Carburetor versus fuel injection. Now, I never had an issue with the RMX fuel injection at all, but I'm assuming if I did, it would be harder to fix than the carburetor. I've also had no issues with the carburetor on the DRZ. So, fuel injection, everyone seems to think it's better, so we'll just say the fuel injection is better. But I think it's personal choice in a way, and I've had no issues with either bike. So I'm going to just go and give the RMX the fuel injection because that seems to be what everyone prefers nowadays. Aftermarket products. Now the DRZ has a variety of aftermarket products, as in Australia this bike is still available brand new in 2023, so there's 23 years of aftermarket stuff being made for this bike, whereas the RMX was available for 2 years only. It was available in 2015 and 2016, then Suzuki stopped making the RMX450 in Australia. So it has a very limited amount of products that you could purchase for the bike, and being the DRZ is more of a all-rounder bike, it had such a variety of aftermarket gear available, and the DRZ will win this competition quite easily. 5-speed gearbox in both bikes, so they're both 5 speeds, there's nothing to talk about in that topic. Brakes, also pretty much the same. They're the same brand of brakes, they're the same size disc and all that sort of thing, so brakes pretty much the same sort of thing in both bikes. Overheating on the motorcycles. Now I've ridden this bike here, the DRZ, on a very hot 40-degree day on a tough trail, and my DRZ did not overheat. Whereas me and my brother both experienced, both our RMXs would overheat quite easily on some of the tougher trails. So the RMX most definitely needed a fan to go onto the radiator to keep those engine temperatures cooler, whereas so far my DRZ hasn't required a fan. So down the track maybe it will need a fan, I don't know, but so far I haven't had the DRZ overheat, whereas the RMXs, both of our RMXs would overheat quite easily. So the DRZ is much better for that. Me and my brother were out on a ride with my friends, and 2 of my friends had DRZ400s. And we came upon a tough rock challenge that both of my friends didn't want to ride their DRZs up as it was above their skill level. So my brother took one DRZ up and I took up the other DRZ. And we both had to take our RMXs up. Now my brother just smashed it with both bikes, launched his RMX450Z straight up the rock wall, and then he did my friend's DRZ straight up the rock wall. That's actually this DRZ here, because I bought that bike from my friend. Both bikes did it quite easily, but when it came to my turn to do it, well, I did it a little bit less risky than my brother, and I took my RMX up first, and it got up, and I was happy with that. And then I took my friend's DRZ up. Now, I hadn't ridden a DRZ really, and I didn't know what to expect from the bike. But by the time I got it to the top of that rock wall, I thought to myself, wow, this DRZ has gotten up this wall easier than I could get my RMX up. And I was quite surprised. So, as far as the rideability of both bikes, I find the DRZ is just as, if not better than the RMX450Z. Resale value. One day you may want to sell your motorcycle, and in the second-hand market, the resale value on the RMX450Z is not very good. In fact, I sold my bike for way less money than I was hoping to get, because the amount of people that are willing to purchase one of the RMX450Zs is far less people than are willing to buy a used DRZ400. So in resale value, the DRZ is more appealing, therefore it will demand a higher price, and also lose less money, because you've got to remember you're paying top dollar to get that RMX out of the showroom from Suzuki, whereas the DRZ is much cheaper. So the difference in pricing that you lose is far greater on the RMX450Z. So in resale value, the DRZ would be a far better bike. The weight of both bikes. Suzuki's RMX450 came out of the showroom weighing about 125 kilos. And the DRZ, according to Suzuki, comes out of the showroom weighing 136 kilos. So the RMX is definitely, about 11 to 12 kilos lighter than the DRZ400. Let's talk a little bit more about both engines on these bikes in the way of rideability. Now that RMX was a fire-breathing dragon and it really cracked, whereas this one here is a little bit more mild, but it doesn't mean it's gutless. And when it comes to riding single trails or tougher type of trails, this engine is far more capable than that RMX. All that RMX ever wanted to do was stall the engine and either go flat stick or have nothing. So it was a very hard bike to ride when the going gets tough, because that engine just doesn't want to cooperate. It won't lug up anything, it won't tractor its way through nothing, it won't do any of those kinds of things. It's either massive wheel spin or stall in the engine. So the DRZ is a far better and easier to ride bike and more capable because of this than that 450 ever was. So the DRZ is a far more rider friendly and fun bike to ride. In my opinion, the engine in the DRZ is just brilliant for what it is, whereas that RMX was only good for going flat stick, and that was about it. Now let's talk about long distance riding. The DRZ is well known to go long distances with those longer service intervals and just that reliability that the DRZ has. Whereas if the RMX was to go from one side of Australia to the other side of Australia, you'd probably have 3 engine rebuilds by the time you get to the other end. Whereas the DRZ will do that day in, day out, day in, day out. So if you're after a motorcycle that you also wanted to go commute, say, to and from work with, the DRZ is a far better choice, as it can put up with that kind of riding, whereas the RMX, forget about it, you'll be rebuilding the engine every 3 months. At the end of the day, riding a dirt bike is about fun. And I think you'll have more fun on the DRZ400 than you will the RMX, simply because of the engine on this DRZ. It is just so usable, so rider friendly. The suspension is nice and plush and it will just absorb the stuff, whereas the RMX bounce you from one end to the next. You're constantly stalling that engine, and it was really only good for just burning up and down here and there. Whereas the DRZ, I find that I can get more places on this DRZ than I ever could dream of on that RMX. The DRZ builds your confidence up, the RMX takes all your confidence away. So I think as far as fun goes, the DRZ is a much more fun bike to ride. The test of time. Now the DRZ in Australia has been around since the year 2000. Today it is 2023 and you can still purchase this bike brand new from the Suzuki dealership, unchanged from 2000. Whereas the RMX had a short-lived life in Australia as a road registered bike. It was available in 2015 and 2016, and in 2017 the RMX no longer existed in Australia. It seemed as though it was a failed experiment from Suzuki, as sales were low on the RMX450, and by the time 2017 came around, it was no longer available. Okay, after doing my comparison on both bikes, I've come up with the DRZ gaining 9 points and the RMX gaining 4 points. With the DRZ's value being $3,900 less, that's almost $4,000 to get them both to the same playing level. That's a lot of money. And with the rideability of the DRZ, the far better engine that I believe doesn't overheat, it takes on the stuff much better. The suspension seems to handle better than the RMX, and really the RMX only has that tough power, the fast power, and the looks of the bike that are over the top of the DRZ. Everything else I think the RMX has fallen short on. And as far as fun goes, I have way more fun on this DRZ than I ever did on that RMX450Z. So if you own an RMX450Z, well, I'm sorry, I like the DRZ more and I think it's a better bike. But don't worry too much if you own an RMX450Z. I've ridden plenty of those WR450s too, and I think the RMX is better than them WR450s because they're not much fun either. So there you have it. I like the DRZ and I think it's a better bike overall than the RMX450Z. So if you like this kind of thing, consider subscribing, and you can also follow Broken Sprocket on Instagram. Until next time, see you.